My name is Margaret Ellis. I spent 31 years working as a registered nurse, most of them on the night shift at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Baltimore. People always asked me how I survived it, the overnight hours, the fluorescent lights that hummed like something alive, the particular silence of a hospital after midnight when the visitors had all gone home and it was just us and the patients, and whatever the darkness outside the windows was holding. I survived it the same way I survived everything else in my life. One small thing at a time. My husband Gerald passed away 4 years ago this past February. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to funeral was 11 weeks, and I remember thinking during those 11 weeks that time had become something different. Not fast, not slow, just wrong, like a clock someone had tilted sideways. After he was gone, I went back to work because I did not know what else to do with my hands. Gerald had been the one who cooked. Gerald had been the one who filled the silence. Without him, the house on Pemberton Street felt like a place I was visiting, rather than a place I lived. My daughter Renee wanted me to retire. She called every Sunday from Phoenix and made the same argument in slightly different words. I was 63 years old. I had my pension. I had Gerald's life insurance. There was no reason, she said, for me to keep working nights in a hospital when I could be resting, traveling, doing something for myself for once. What Renee didn't understand was that the night shift was the only place I still felt like myself. St. Resto. Catherine's parking structure was 3 blocks from the nurse's entrance, and the walk between them cut through a stretch of road that the hospital administration had discussed improving for years, without ever quite getting around to it. Broken streetlights, a narrow sidewalk that disappeared entirely near the loading dock, the kind of place that was fine in July and genuinely unpleasant in November when the wind came off the bay and the pavement was slick with something that had frozen and thawed and frozen again. The shuttle service the hospital provided ran until 11. My shift ended at 12:30. For the first year after Gerald died, I drove myself, but then my car, a 2009 Camry that Gerald had maintained with what I can only describe as devotion, developed a transmission problem that my mechanic said would cost more to fix than the car was worth. I sold it, told myself I would buy something new in the spring, and started using the rideshare app my coworker Beverly had put on my phone during a slow Tuesday in October. That was how I met the driver I came to know as Walter. His full name, I would learn much later, was Walter Graves. He was 54 years old. A former maintenance supervisor who had taken up driving after a back injury ended his previous career. He drove a dark green sedan that was always clean, not just wiped down but genuinely clean, the kind of clean that takes effort. And he kept the radio on low, a station that played older R&B, nothing jarring, nothing that demanded your attention. The first night he picked me up, I was tired in the specific way that only night shift nurses understand. Not sleepy exactly, scraped, like the inside of something that had been emptied out. I got in without saying much, gave him the address, and watched Baltimore slide past the window in the dark. He didn't try to fill the silence. That was the first thing I noticed about Walter. The second thing I noticed was that he waited, every time, until I had my key in my hand, before he pulled away from the curb. I don't know when I started thinking of him as my driver. Probably somewhere around the 3rd or 4th week, when I realized I had started requesting him specifically and that he always accepted. He drove me home 4 nights a week, sometimes 5, and the route took about 20 minutes depending on traffic near the harbor. We talked sometimes, not always. He had a son named Deshaun who was studying engineering at Morgan State, and he mentioned him the way parents mention children they are proud of, but trying not to crowd. Carefully, with a kind of held-back warmth. I told him about Renee, about Gerald, about the night shift, what it was really like. He listened the way some people listen, where you can tell they are actually taking in what you say, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. Somewhere around the 6-week mark, I started bringing him coffee. It wasn't a grand gesture. I want to be clear about that. I passed the vending machine near the nurse's station every night on my way out. And I had noticed, the few times Walter had come inside to wait during a rainstorm, that he drank his coffee black with no sugar, so I started getting two. It cost $1.50 from the machine, and I handed it through the window when I got in, and that was the whole of it. He thanked me the first time with what seemed like genuine surprise, as if the gesture was larger than it was. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," I said. "I was already there." After that it became a habit. Coffee on Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. Whatever the machine had. Sometimes it was decent. Sometimes it tasted like the cup had been filled from a puddle. But Walter always accepted it with the same straightforward thank you. No fuss, no performance. I appreciated that. I had spent enough of my life around people who made a production of small kindnesses, either giving them or receiving them, and the older I got, the more I valued people who could accept a cup of coffee like an adult. The fall deepened. The walk from the nurse's entrance got colder. My colleague Darnell started offering to walk me to the pickup spot on the worst nights, and I let him on the nights when the freezing rain was bad. But mostly I made the walk alone and was glad for the 3 minutes of cold air before getting into the warm car. My neighbor across the street, a man named Curtis Hale, had been a source of low-level unease for me since Gerald died. Curtis was in his mid-50s, divorced, and had moved into the house across from ours about 2 years before Gerald's diagnosis. He was superficially friendly. He waved. He occasionally brought his trash cans in from the curb without being asked. He had introduced himself properly and shaken Gerald's hand. But there had always been something about the way he watched the house that I couldn't quite name. Gerald used to say I was imagining it. Maybe I was. After Gerald died, though, and it was just me in the house, the feeling got harder to dismiss. Nothing I could point to, nothing I could complain about. Just a quality of attention that felt like more than neighborly interest. My son-in-law, David, had put a security camera on my front porch after Gerald passed. Renee had insisted on it. I checked it occasionally, but had never seen anything that alarmed me. Just the ordinary footage of a quiet street, delivery drivers, the mail carrier, a cat from somewhere down the block that visited my front steps with regularity. In late November, 2 things happened close together. The first was that I noticed Curtis's schedule had changed. He had worked regular daytime hours as long as I had known him, leaving around 8 in the morning, returning around 6. But starting in early November, he seemed to be home more. His car was in the driveway at odd hours. He was on his porch in the evenings more often than he used to be, sometimes as late as midnight, and twice, when I came home from my shift, I saw the glow of a phone screen in his car, which was parked not in his own driveway, but along the curb 2 houses down. Both times I told myself there was an explanation. Maybe he was between jobs. Maybe he was going through something. People sat in their cars at night for all kinds of reasons. The second thing was a conversation I had with my next-door neighbor, Sylvia, who was 71 and had lived on Pemberton Street since before I was born. Sylvia had told me, almost in passing, that she had seen someone in my backyard 3 weeks earlier. She had assumed it was me, she said, until she mentioned it on the phone to her granddaughter, and her granddaughter pointed out that I worked nights and wouldn't have been home at that hour. She apologized for not telling me sooner. I told her it was fine. I said it with more conviction than I felt. That night I went through the camera footage from the past month. The front porch camera showed nothing unusual, but the camera only covered the front. I did not have a camera in the back. I don't know what I was expecting when I got into Walter's car that Friday. I hadn't told anyone what Sylvia had said except Renee, who immediately began a new campaign for me to move to Phoenix, which was not helpful. I had spent the shift turning it over in my mind between patients, setting it down and picking it up again, and by the time midnight came I was tired and worried in a way I couldn't quite separate from each other. Walter had the heat on. The R&B station was playing something slow. I handed him his coffee through the gap between the seats, and he took it, and we pulled out of the hospital driveway and onto the empty street. We were 10 minutes from home, just past the bridge at Holbrook Avenue, when Walter said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Not the way people are quiet when they're gathering courage, more like the way they're quiet when they're deciding how much to say. "Does anyone have a reason to be watching your house?" he asked. My hands went still in my lap. "Why are you asking me that?" I said. He told me. 2 weeks earlier, on a Wednesday night, he had dropped me off and was pulling away from the curb when he noticed a car he didn't recognize. A silver or light gray sedan, sitting about half a block down with its lights off. He hadn't thought much of it. The second time, the following Saturday, the same car or one very similar was parked in a slightly different spot, same lights off, same direction facing my house. The third time had been this past Tuesday. "The reason I'm telling you now," Walter said, "is because tonight, when I turned onto your street, that car was there again, and there was someone standing in the gap between your house and the Hensley place next door." He had not turned into the street. He had driven past and continued toward the harbor. I realized we were not going to my house. "Walter," I said, "I'm not taking you home tonight," he said. "Not until we figure this out." My first feeling, I am not proud to say, was irritation. I was 63 years old. I had handled Gerald's illness and death and the aftermath largely by myself. I did not like being managed, even gently, even by someone I trusted. I started to say something about how I was perfectly capable of deciding where I was and was not going. Then I stopped, because the thing was, and I knew this from 31 years of nursing, from every patient who had ignored a symptom for 6 months before coming in, the feeling I had underneath the irritation was relief. Someone had noticed. Someone had been paying attention when I wasn't. "Where are we going?" I asked. "There's an all-night diner on Keswick," he said. "You can sit there and get warm and call someone, and I'm going to go back and get the plate number." I told him not to do that. I told him we should call the police. He agreed, more readily than I expected. I think he had been prepared for more resistance from me. I called 911 from the booth of a diner where the counter stools had red vinyl seats, and a woman named Patrice refilled my coffee without being asked and did not comment on the fact that I appeared to be quietly coming apart at the seams. Walter sat across from me and drank his own coffee and did not say anything reassuring or unhelpful. He just sat there, which was what I needed. 2 officers went to my street. They found the silver sedan. It turned out to be a Honda Civic registered to a name I didn't recognize. They knocked on Curtis Hale's door. What happened after that, I would learn in pieces over the following days, some from the detective who called me the next morning, some from Sylvia, who knew things about the neighborhood that no camera system could have captured. Curtis had been the one in my backyard 3 weeks earlier, and on at least 2 other occasions before that. What the police found, after the kind of investigation that takes weeks and involves phone records and security footage from businesses on nearby streets, was that Curtis had been in contact with someone who had reason to believe that Gerald had left behind physical documents related to a property dispute. Something from Gerald's years working as a title examiner before he retired, involving a parcel of land in Anne Arundel County. Curtis had some connection to the other party in that dispute. The details were complicated and legal, and I will not pretend I understood all of them. What I understood was that someone had believed there was something in my house worth having, and that they had been patient about trying to get it. The person in the silver Civic turned out to be a cousin of Curtis's, brought in to watch the house and establish my schedule, which they had learned, at least in part, by watching my comings and goings. The nights I came home at 12:40. The nights I came home later. The nights, apparently, when my house was empty and dark for the longest stretch. I have thought many times since then about what would have happened if I had come home that Friday night. If Walter had simply driven me to my door as usual and driven away. I don't know. The police told me that the charge was ultimately criminal trespassing and conspiracy, not anything more serious, but I also know there had been someone standing in the shadows between my house and Sylvia's at nearly 1 in the morning, and I know what my house looks like from the outside at that hour. Dark, quiet, a woman who lives alone. I know what that means. Walter drove me to Renee's cousin Patricia's house that night, where I slept on a pull-out sofa under a quilt that smelled like someone else's fabric softener, and woke up at 7 in the morning, to the sound of Patricia's children getting ready for school. Normal, ordinary sounds. I lay there and listened to them and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was tight. In the weeks that followed, while the investigation proceeded and I had a security system installed that would have satisfied Renee under any circumstances, I kept thinking about the coffee. $1.50 from a vending machine. Black, no sugar, 4 times a week for 2 months. That was what Walter had seen, the thing that made him pay attention in the first place. Not because I had done something extraordinary, just because I had been present enough to notice what he drank, and ordinary enough to act on it, and somewhere in that exchange of small, ordinary things, he had begun to pay attention to my life, the way you pay attention to the lives of people who have been kind to you. He noticed the car because he was still thinking about me after he drove away. That was all it was. He cared enough to look back. I asked him about it once, a few weeks later, after things had settled. I asked him when he had first noticed the car, whether he had been suspicious from the beginning or whether it had crept up on him. He thought about it for a moment in that considered way he had. The first time I saw it, I didn't think much, he said. Second time, I started paying attention. Third time, I knew. Why did you wait to tell me? I asked. Because I wasn't sure, he said, and I didn't want to scare you over nothing. That answer has stayed with me. Not sure, but paying attention. Not wanting to alarm, but not willing to look away. That particular combination of care and restraint is rarer than people think. In my years of nursing, I had seen what happened when people alarmed too easily and what happened when people dismissed too readily, and I knew the cost of both. Walter had found something in the middle of those two things. Some balance that I recognized as the mark of a person who had thought carefully about the world and his place in it. I learned more about him as the months went on. The back injury that had ended his previous career had also ended, or at least severely strained, his marriage. His son Deshaun had taken his mother's side in the early years of the separation, and there had been a period. Walter mentioned it once. Briefly, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has made his peace with a painful thing, when they barely spoke. It had gotten better. Deshaun was coming home for Christmas that year, the first time in 3 years, and Walter mentioned this with the same held-back warmth I had noticed when he spoke of his son from the very beginning. I told him I was glad. I was. Renee flew in from Phoenix in December, partly to see me and partly to supervise the security upgrades with an energy that I can only describe as organized anxiety. She met Walter when he picked me up one evening, and she assessed him in the particular way she assessed everyone, quickly, thoroughly, and without much visible expression, and afterward in the car on the way to dinner, she said, "He seems like a good man." "He is," I said. "You should keep bringing him coffee," she said. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed without effort since Gerald died. I want to note that because I think it matters, not the laugh itself, but the effortlessness of it. The way it came without me having to work toward it. There is a thing I have tried to explain to younger nurses over the years, something I was told early in my own career by a woman named Hattie, who had been on night shift at St. Catherine's since before the building was renovated. She said, in this work and in this life, you cannot control most of what happens. You cannot prevent the diagnoses, the accidents, the slow erosions of time. What you can do is be present, pay attention, do the small things with enough care that the people around you know they are seen. That's all it is. You make someone feel seen, and something in them opens, some door that was closed. And through that open door flows whatever it is that people need in order to keep going. Sometimes it is practical help. Sometimes it is just the knowledge that the world still contains people who will hand you a cup of coffee without needing a reason. Walter and Deshaun had dinner at my house the following spring. I made the pot roast I used to make for Gerald, with the potatoes and the carrots and the bread that Renee says is too much food for any reasonable occasion. Sylvia came from next door. Patricia brought her kids. It was a full table. Afterward, when everyone had gone and I was washing dishes and the house was quiet in the way it had learned to be quiet after Gerald, which is to say, still sad in some corner that will probably always be sad, but no longer empty. I stood at the kitchen window and looked across at the house where Curtis Hale had lived. There was a light in the window that belonged to the family who had moved in after he left. A young couple with a baby. Normal, ordinary light. I dried my hands and went to sit on the porch for a while. The street was still. Down at the end of the block, a neighbor's dog was barking at something it had decided was worth barking at, and then it stopped, and there was just the sound of Baltimore at night. Distant traffic, a radio somewhere, the particular hum of a city that is always partway awake. I thought about Gerald. I thought about Renee and David and Phoenix. I thought about Walter driving home, Deshawn in the passenger seat, and whatever they were talking about in the car, easy or difficult or somewhere in between. I thought about what Hattie had told me all those years ago, and I thought about $1.50 and a vending machine, and a man who, because someone had noticed what he took in his coffee, looked back at the street one more time before he drove away. Be kind. Not for what you'll get in return. Not because the world will always reward it or even notice it. Be kind, because it is the only way to stay awake to the people around you, really awake. And staying awake is the only way any of us are going to get through this. That's the whole lesson. That's the only one I've got.